Hi, I'm Angus Cress Gillespie, your host for Old Ways in New Jersey, here on East Brunswick Television. I'm here today in the studio with Nikolai Burlakoff of Ossining, New York, who's a well-respected folklorist. After completing his graduate work in folklore at Indiana University, Nick published numerous scholarly articles on a wide variety of topics. For more than 25 years, he has worked in the field of applied folklore, serving as museum director, community organizer, and consultant to nonprofit organizations. Nick has recently published a book called The World of Borsch, and I'm pleased that it's brought him to our studio today. Nick, just to begin with the beginning, it's my understanding that borscht is a soup primarily made with beets, and it's popular in Eastern Europe. Are we on the same track so far?
Yes, in Eastern Europe, at this point, I'd say all over the world, one way or another.
Okay. And from our earlier conversation, I understand you didn't really like beets as a young man.
No, in fact, I disliked beets quite intensely. They were too spicy, and I would put them aside and trying not to eat them. And
as a youngster?
Yeah, as a youngster, then was finally my parents would force me, and I'd finally swallow them in total without chewing, so I couldn't taste them. Which is great because now I can swallow any pill made by American pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, and what changed your attitude? Was there a moment or an experience?
Really, I mean, there are different things. There's in college, you had these so-called Harvard beets, which in an institutional setting, kind of tasteless, definitely not offensive, don't add too much, but tasteless. But really that happened with me when I was visiting. I used to go summers when I was in graduate school particularly, and help out my godmother. They lived in Shamokin, Pennsylvania. And they would always put on a feast for me, kind of as a thank you. And they would cook borscht, and godmother would make pirashki, which is a pastry filled with meat, savory pastry.
As an accompaniment.
As an accompaniment, and she made the most wonderful deep-fat fried pirashki and the borscht. And the whole setting, the whole ambience, and also her way of cooking and her recipe turned me around, and I began to love the dish. And
So we said a moment ago, the main ingredient is beets, but you can add potatoes, you can add meat.
Well, it all depends which tradition you come from. And in some traditions, for example, in Lithuania, most borscht are just beets. With some buttermilk, some sour cream, some egg, or sometimes it's beets and a potato, very often a cold potato, sometimes cold borscht. But in a Russian tradition and many Polish traditions, it's beets and different vegetables, a variety of vegetables. In a Mennonite tradition, there's no beets at all, and just cabbage and meat and vegetables and tomatoes. So you know that those recipes did not arise till the 19th century because tomatoes didn't come into that area of the world till the 19th century.
Now, the title of your book is The World of Borsch?
Yes.
What prompted that title?
In part, I was as easy as and as fast as possible get the two ideas I crossed simultaneously. One is that borscht at this point is found everywhere over the world. And as I said in the book, what fascinates me is going to Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam and finding a Russian restaurant with borscht.
Wow.
And one would think, basically a temperate climate type of dish in a tropical setting and very authentic tasting with all the proper ingredients. And the other thing is then recently finding some recipes for Chinese borscht, which I've successfully cooked. So, so it's all over the world. And the other thing that I was trying to get across with that title is because I'm really looking or trying to look at history, Russian history, to a certain degree, international history, the whole issue of globalization, through the lens of this dish. So that's why it's the world of borscht. It's kind of like the world according to Garp.
Okay. Now, I was investigating this, and there's different spellings. Like you use Borsch, am I right? But sometimes I see it with a T on the end.
Yeah, that's, in fact, at this point becoming the dominant international English language, in large part because of the internet. But that is really the German or Yiddish transliteration of the sh sound in Russian. And it's in French it would be TSCH, okay? In German, it's Borsch as we know it. So it's very much shows the acceptance, at least on the internet, of the German transliteration as opposed to the what I'd call English transliteration, which I'm using.
So nowadays, the standard spelling would be...
I wouldn't say standard, but I'd say the dominant one.
Would be without the T.
With the T.
Oh, with the T.
With the T.
I see, okay. Yeah. Now, we all know that writing a book takes a lot of time and effort. What was your motivation to press ahead with this project? Initially,
really, I wrote a piece reminiscing about those experiences in Shamokin. And really what I wanted to do is to get across a slice of life of people who have worked very hard, who've gone through incredibly horrible circumstances and who've maintained their dignity, their humor, and their generosity towards other people. And I wanted to kind of memorialize that. And at the same time, as a folklorist, I was interested, initially I was thinking of doing it as a field project, collecting a bunch of traditional recipes and doing that. That unfortunately did not become feasible because I realized how worldwide it is, and I just didn't have the resources to go all over the world to collect it.
Yeah.
So I had to rely on cookbooks, and then I became very much interested in the cookbooks themselves as an expression, a kind of a time capsule of a time and an attitude, and found that very, very fascinating. Some very interesting conclusions came out of that. Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that it sort of started as a memoir, and then you built out from that.
Essentially, yes. That's
And how long did this whole thing unfold?
If I finish it this year, roughly 20 years.
Okay. So when can we expect it to be released?
We're hoping, we're discussing with the publisher that within 30 to 60 days.
Okay. Yeah. And why? I think I know the answer, but why did it take so long?
That's a hard one to answer, really. I think, and part of it, the book wasn't ready to be out. To be, I mean, it sounds kind of mystical and a little vague and New Age-ish or something like that. But I think it had to be a confluence of understanding, and part of it perhaps my coming to a certain point in life to try to express all the aspects that I felt were inherently there, and that had I written it earlier, it wouldn't have been as complete as it is today.
So you weren't writing it for 20 years, but you were absorbing information over 20 years.
Yeah, and collecting stuff and writing pieces here and there from time to time, yes.
And how come you never abandoned the project?
Because that commitment to my godmother and to a whole generation of people who went through all that stuff and still maintain it. I'm here as a result of their commitment and their generosity.
And you mentioned to me earlier the internet was helpful.
I don't think in some ways the book would have been possible without the internet, and maybe that's the answer why it got finished now, is because the internet is. Because there's a lot of little details that under normal scholarly procedures, you really would have to really invest full time, 20 years, to find, which today can be found literally in seconds. Like, for example,
With a few clicks of the mouse.
precisely, like finding the Chinese Borsch recipe, which I tried for about 3 years, and then I found it on the internet, okay, of all the places. And then I tested with the Chinese, and it worked. They recognized it as what it is. So I knew it was a genuine, dish.
Yeah. And I assume you were getting support from your family in this project.
Well, if it weren't for my wife, who's number one is my editor, and it's always nice to have an in-house editor, okay? She keeps insisting because she feels that once I finish with this, I'm free to do some of the other stuff in my life.
like household chores, perhaps.
You got it. Very important.
Now, in everyday conversation with people, I usually say that Borsch is Russian, but I've been reading up on the subject, and some authors say that it's Ukrainian. So how do we sort all this out?
I have absolutely no problems personally if Ukrainians taking claim to Borsch. I would say that the evidence that I've come across that beat Borsch is in all probability very much the dominant, if not the Ukrainian dish. Borsch has been in a Russian cuisine before there was technically a Ukraine, okay? But it wasn't necessarily beet. It was kvass-based, which is essentially a fermentation. Borsch originated as a dish made out of what we call hog wheat, and not out of beets. The beets came in later on, roughly in the 18th century, and they came via Constantinople, and Ukraine was the obvious area for the beets to be developed first, and then the use of beets traveled up north. Before that, the dominant root vegetable was turnips, not beet.
So the Ukrainian claim for primacy is not altogether far-fetched.
No, not at all. But I think that we're really talking about two Borsch traditions. And if I were talking about Borsch tradition, I'd say the beet is probably Ukraine has a very solid claim to Ukrainians. But the fermented Borsch type related to the original Borsch plant is all probability more centered around Poland.
Oh, okay.
And it's a very important dish in Polish cuisine, and they've maintained the fermented type as a very strong. They call it white borscht or jour, and they have 3 or 4 different varieties. So it's a very much part of their cuisine, just as it is in Ukraine.
Should it be served hot or cold?
Either way. There are certain types of borscht that lend themselves to being served hot. This is predominantly the heavy vegetable, potatoes, cabbage borscht, which is served hot, and the beet with buttermilk type of borscht, which in Russian is called svikolnik, is probably usually served cold, and it's delicious cold. And on a hot summer, humid day, it's just a wonderful luncheon or even supper dish. Yeah.
And isn't it true that it's often served with thick, dark, heavy bread?
The accompaniments to borscht could constitute a whole another book, and I just don't want to invest the time.
Yeah.
Bread is very much part of it, but also basically cheese tarts, pampushki, which are kind of like fritters, and very popular in the Ukraine. Again, that's the other aspect of borscht making, that depending on what you accompany it with, it determines the region where it's from. Okay, and there are different names for the same. So again, based on the naming of it, then you know where something is from. So, but it's a very wide. But I think in most cases, dark bread is the accepted accompaniment to bread, and at least in the Russian tradition, you don't eat soup without bread. Period.
And isn't it true that it's often served with sour cream?
Sour cream, or technically the Russian sour cream is different from American sour cream.
Okay.
And one of the very interesting things when you have an ethnic, the adaptation of taste, the Russian sour cream tastes closer to what today is available in our supermarkets is the Mexican crema. Okay, it's creamier, it's a little bit more liquid. But what happened is that the Russians determined in kind of the communal, when they immigrated to American, that the closest thing that tastes to real Russian sour cream is Breakstone sour cream. So if 9 out of 10 times, if you're served borscht by Russian ethnic, it'll be with Breakstone sour cream, and not another one, because that to them is most reminiscent of the original taste.
And is it mixed in, or is it served as a dollop on top?
The traditions vary, and again, in a fancy restaurant, it'll be nicely, decorated, and normally just mixed in.
And we've hinted around this. Give us a quick rundown on the regional variation.
You have the Russian style with meat and cabbage. You've got the Polish style, which can be with meat and cabbage or just beets. You have the Ukrainian style, which will, the Chernihiv, the Kiev, various major cities in the Ukraine, the Odessa type, which will include things like chicken, like goose, like duck as a meat, as I mentioned earlier, an Arctic style with seal meat. So, you have a whole range of...
Well, what would you say was the most unusual recipe that you collected?
I would say the first one that absolutely struck me, and it took me a little while to research, was with sea cabbage. And the other one was...
What is sea cabbage?
Sea cabbage is essentially a form of kelp.
Ah.
And it was a recipe that I found in a cookbook from a nunnery in northern Russia, where kelp is obviously, because of the White Sea, is largely and easily available, as opposed to cabbage, which does not grow in the winter, obviously.
I assume that when you would go to a used bookstore, you would go straight for the cookbook section.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yes. And the other one was that absolutely blew me away was the Mennonite dish, because the Mennonite went to Paraguay for a while as a group. And they developed a borscht variety where they used green papaya instead of cabbage.
Huh.
And so that, to me,
That's pretty unusual.
Yes,
Yeah.
borscht with green papaya.
Now, over the years, you've collected a lot of cookbooks.
Yes.
Is there any one that stands out in your memory?
My favorite, by far, recently has been a cookbook that was actually produced in the United States during World War II, called Russian Cooking for American Home, Wartime Edition. And it was a fundraiser for a group called Russian War Relief. And it was a combination of a bunch of American, old-time American, kindly oriented people, and a whole bunch of Russian emigres who escaped communism, who came together to create a cookbook as a fundraiser to send packages, relief packages, to people in the Soviet Union. Yeah. It was really a coming together of a number of cultures and a number of people, and you have, as far as I know, that's the first recipe of James Beard's that I found when he just started on his career. Found the recipes from the wife of Pitirim Sorokin, who was the founder of the sociology department at Harvard. A whole slew of people. Pierre Smirnov and Efis, which is the vodka company that submitted some recipes. So you have this incredible amalgam of really people who are trying to help people in need, what Pitirim Sorokin called a community of altruism. The sad part is that this whole thing got caught up in the political stuff, and was declared, the sponsoring committee was declared as a communist front by FBI with the leadership of certain senators, and soon after the war became totally defunct, you know.
That is so interesting because during World War II, Russia was our ally. And I recall the Defense Department put out the comic book for American soldiers called Your Buddy Ivan. And it was trying to explain Russian culture to American soldiers. But after the war, the Cold War kicks in, and that whole warm feeling towards Russia sort of goes by the board.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the teens in the 20s, you saw a very strong right wing in America opposition to anarchists and quote unquote communism, and the Red Scare, the whole bit. And then that kind of went down during the beginning of the Great Depression. There was actually a pretty strong communist movement in the United States, more because people were looking for social justice, not so much that they were interested in communism per se. And so there was a very strong right-wing coalition that was waiting for their moment. And during the beginning of the war years and in the war years, they became more and more powerful until we finally got Senator McCarthy and that whole blot on America's history as far as I'm concerned.
You collected so many cookbooks. What's the takeaway from all your experience with cookbooks?
Well, number one, they're a very important literary genre as well as just a practical guide. That's one thing. The other thing is, one of the things that I found fascinating, that in the 19th century, it's essentially women who had very limited access to social power, if you want to say, who determined national cuisines in Russia with Malachovets, publishing her cookbook with some, thousands upon thousands of recipes. In the United States with Fannie Farmer.
So it's a vehicle. Beaton. It's a vehicle for empowerment of women.
It became very much, and not only empowerment of women as individuals, because all these ladies did well as a consequence, but they defined the national cuisine. So they defined the culture, which you can't get more powerful than that, as far as I'm concerned.
Would you call your book a cookbook?
No. Yes, it has recipes.
Yeah, okay.
But I haven't figured out what genre, or if it fits any genre. There's some memoir in it. But it's really what I'm hoping it's gonna be perceived as a cookbook about people and the quiet, truly heroes, not the stuff that we see on television, the quiet people who lead lives and through the gifts that they have, transferring it to the next generation, standing for some kind of an integrity and sharing a beauty in their life. Every cookbook that I mention and that I review in this book has behind it an extraordinary human being. Extraordinary. And that to me is the joy of, and that's one of the reasons I continued on with this quest.
Would it be fair to call it an ethnographic study then?
Yes, but you could also look upon it as a historical study and a culinary study and maybe even a literary piece. Who knows?
So how do you think readers will react?
I'm looking for a special kind of reader. Really. I'm looking for a reader who can get past the genre description, past expectations, and look at what is in front of them and get excited by it. So far, every early reader I've had of the manuscript has liked, and they kind of wished that the next chapter would be more in line with what they already liked in the previous chapter.
Yeah.
But, so it's been a very kind of interesting where they would get into it and like something, but then I'd go in a different direction in the next chapter.
Right.
But then the next reader would see that chapter as that, the one that they read. So I'm hoping it resonates with a lot of people in a lot of different ways.
Do you have any regrets regarding this project?
Yes, I wish I were ready, or the book were ready to be finished years ago.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Because that would have been, I think, a boon, and I could have done other stuff in addition to this. But I don't regret, in a real sense. I really don't. Yeah.
What's next on your writing agenda?
Well, there is my book on the Kalmyks coming out, and right now I'm in a process of putting on the finishing touches on a collection. It's about two Kalmyk New Years, which is, I think they're one of the few people who actually have two New Years every year, and includes some poetry, a translation of a folk tale, and an analysis which includes even a feminist analysis showing how a mythical folk tale can be read from a feminist point of view, which makes an interesting interpretation of mythology.
Very interesting. Well, this has really been fascinating. You wouldn't think you can write a whole book about Borsch, but obviously you have. How can our viewers go about obtaining a copy?
Well, the easiest thing to do, there is a website that will be online within the week, aelitapress.com.
How do you spell that?
AELITAPRESS.org, not .com, sorry, .org, and that's it.
Okay.
And it will be, as soon as the publisher, Aelita Press, makes it available, it will be available.
Thanks for coming out to East Brunswick today.
Well,
and sharing
thank you for
that
your
with us.
courtesy and the wonderful support staff here and your wonderful questions.
Okay.